Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
In 2028, just 2 years from now, we will have the 20th anniversary of the deep recession of 2008. And a year after that, we will have the 100th anniversary of the New York Stock Exchange crash, which eventually led to the Great Depression and took down with it the entire world economy minus the Soviet Union, which was outside at the time of the capitalist world system. The only economy, in fact, that was growing while the rest of the world was in a serious economic contraction. There have been many studies that have been conducted by individual economists around the world, as well as by financial institutions. The most important one, in my estimation, a very serious study based on empirical evidence as well as various interviews, was conducted by the World Economic Forum for 2026, this year, in other words. The World Economic Forum report interviewed 1,300 world leaders and experts in international political economy. What it found is half of those lead to turbulent waters for the next 2 years, 2026 to 2027. Only 1% were convinced that this would not be the case, that it would be smooth sailing, steady growth on a world scale. Only 1% in this study. Even worse, 57%, according to the World Economic Forum, 57% of those interviewed believe that in the next 10 years, 2026 to 2035, the world economy will face some serious challenges, very serious challenges, in part because of the massive concentration of capital on a world scale, but also because of artificial intelligence, which many expect, including, by the way, artificial intelligence enthusiasts, including those people. This sector of the rapidly growing high-tech economy will displace hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. This does not mean that it has to be so, and it may not be so, but the scenario that artificial intelligence will actually add jobs rather than take away has not been proved to be the case so far, while artificial intelligence remains in its embryonic stage, and we have to wait and see how that develops. Now, the larger question here, of course, is how the world economy will be managed. One of the things that many economists agree and political science observers agree about the Great Depression is the absence of an international system of management to mitigate, to lessen the impact of the economic contraction during the 1930s. A system was developed, in fact, in the United States, the Bretton Woods system, to do exactly that. However, this system is being undermined from within, and especially from the core country in the capitalist world system, namely the United States, which actually developed that system. This in itself will cause economic turbulence. One of the reasons that the World Economic Forum people who were interviewed, over 1,300 of them, and they concluded they're so pessimistic, with the exception of the 1%, is precisely because of that. Namely, the question of achieving market equilibrium on a world scale, when in fact you have the core country in the world system, the United States, undermining it in various respects by not observing the rules of the World Trade Organization, imposing tariff sanctions, using its considerable defense sector on a world scale to destabilize the entire world, geopolitically and geoeconomically. Now, if we step back and look at the world system, and I ask you, by the way, to look at the longer analytical video. This is just an introductory session. What we see in the last 500 years is that capitalism expands and contracts. Okay, the issue is not if we have a recession, but how deep and how long it will last, and to what degree will it devastate and a large percentage of the population. Throughout the 500 history, the population that's devastated by the contracting economic cycle, in other words, recession or depressions, are, of course, the working people, people who work for a living. Now, one interesting thing, and I had written about this several years ago, about a decade ago or so, is that the new norm with recessions, with economic contracting cycles, is that the economic contracting cycle itself, when followed by a recovery cycle, doesn't really impact everyone. It leaves behind, in still lingering in the recessionary cycle of the economy, many in the working class. This is one of the reasons that we see downward social mobility across the world, with few exceptions, by the way. We see downward social mobility partly because of that, because the recovery cycle continues to live behind a segment, a substantial segment of the working class. They don't recover. So this has become the new norm. And according to economic studies, empirical economic studies that have been done on this subject, this is especially since the Reagan era. In other words, when the neoliberal model, many people call it globalization model, corporate welfare model, when this was introduced, deregulation, low taxes for corporations and billionaires model, when this system, this political economy was introduced, and I'll talk at length about this in the longer video, that's when we see the new norm of the recovery cycle actually not being a recovery cycle for everyone. It recovery cycle for certainly the for big capital, for the upper middle class, for a segment of the working class, but not for everyone. Now, what are the signs that we have right now that we are in at a stage where we are going to see, and I'm not predicting a recession, a contracting cycle. By the way, I'm not predicting, and I would never be that presumptuous to predict when an economic contracting cycle is going to hit. There's going to be a crash. No one knows. I mean, I have been studying international political economy for decades. That you can't possibly predict it. There are people who accidentally predicted and they turn out to be correct, but that's about all. Because there are so many dynamics in the world capitalist system, and capitalism is a world system. It's not a local economy. It's not a national economy. It's a world system. It always has been. Now, there are signs that are troubling, and these signs include rising unemployment, structural unemployment, and rising underemployment, part-time work. This is especially during the neoliberal model when the part-timers um, became an integral part of what is called in the lingo the gig economy. Part-time work became more and more prevalent, full-time work less so. This, at the same time, is accompanied by stagnation of wages. For this is not stagnation of wages only in the contracting cycle of the economy. In other words, when there's a recession, but for the duration. In fact, United States labor statistics indicate that this stagnation has been the case since 1979, wage stagnation. This is very important because it means that that a segment of the working class and the lower middle class cannot keep up with inflationary pressures. Inflation, in other words, it runs higher, it runs above what their wage scales are. So rising cost of living and structural unemployment and underemployment are part of the problem, not just in the global south in poor countries, but in the core countries. In other words, in the G7, and especially in the United States. Now, the crisis that is coming with a recession, and it's a matter of if, not when, is clearly complicated. Not it's by the way, I already pointed out, I want to mention this again, that contracting cycles, recessions are built in, and depressions are built into the economic system, the capitalist economy. But this time it's complicated by two other factors. One is really interesting because we don't see it that often in the history. We have not seen it that often in the history. The core, which country or countries are in the core of the capitalist system, and which countries are about to replace the old ones and take over. In this case, of course, it's the US versus China. Everybody knows it. And China is already on the driver's seat. For many reasons. We'll talk about it in the analytical video, in the longer video. But it is clear since the second Obama administration announced that we have to be concerned because this is where it's headed. We are in a transition. They will be in the driver's seat. And the fear in the United States is once that country is at the core of the capitalist world system, the China-led BRICS group, they will then determine the course of the world economy, managing the world. This is all about managing the world economy. The question is, of course, to what degree do governments around the world have faith in China, in China's better management of the world economy? Obviously, we have seen recently a number of countries, including Canada and France, and the United Kingdom and Germany, but especially the United Kingdom and Canada, looking to China to better manage the world economy. One reason for that is they are concerned that their national economies are negatively impacted and a recessionary cycle is hastened by the destabilization policies of the United States government, both at the geopolitical level and at the geoeconomic level. The geoeconomic, especially the question of tariffs, and using the considerable power the United States has with regard to its reserve currency, namely the dollar, most widely used for trade around the world, for exchanges around the world, and using that as a weapon, weaponizing the currency, in other words. Now, the question, of course, that I will raise, or many, one of them is very important, is will the transition from the United States as the core of the world economy, the US-led G7 at the core of the world economy, although the G7 followers are beginning to fall apart, manage the economy, continue to manage the economy, and permit a sense of continuity with fewer problems for the world's population of 8 billion people? Or will the United States, and perhaps few others that follow, destabilize to the detriment of the world's population, simply because the US wants to maintain the preeminent hegemonic role and not permit China to have it? As though as though capitalism is that different. It is different, by the way, as we'll see. But capitalism is a world system. It operates on the basic same rules. It has done so. The nuances of public policy, of trade policy, labor policy, investment policy are different. Yeah, the Chinese model is more statist oriented, more neo-mercantilist oriented. The state has a huge role. The question, though, is to what degree can the world economy be managed through international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, but also new institutions under the auspices of the BRICS group, the China-led BRICS group, so that the population on this planet does not bear the burden of this transition of the core from the United States to China. I invite you to join me in the longer analytical video. Please write comments, ask questions, and join this channel. Thank you very much.